What a tariff is and why governments use it is one of those topics that sounds dry at first, but is actually woven into the fabric of daily life in ways most people don't even realize. A tariff is, in its simplest form, a tax or duty placed on goods that are imported from another country. When a shipment of steel from overseas docks at an American port, for example, before it can enter the market, the company bringing it in has to pay the government a set amount, often calculated as a percentage of the item's value. This payment raises the cost of the product for whoever buys it next, whether that's a factory, a store, or eventually you, the consumer. Governments don't just impose tariffs for fun or to fill their treasury, though that is one side benefit. The primary purpose is usually to protect domestic industries from being overwhelmed by cheaper goods from abroad. If a foreign company can sell something at a much lower price than local producers, whether because of lower wages, less strict environmental laws, or government subsidies, local businesses can struggle to survive. Tariffs level the playing field by making imported goods more expensive, giving local industries a fighting chance. But tariffs can also be used for other reasons. Sometimes as a bargaining chip in negotiations with other countries, sometimes as a punishment for what a government sees as unfair practices, and sometimes to encourage people to buy more locally made products. In a way, tariffs are like a country putting up a small fence around its market, not to keep everything out, but to make sure outsiders have to pay before they step in. The tricky part is that every fence you put up changes the flow of trade, and those changes ripple out through jobs, prices, and relationships between nations. I can expand the rest of the keynotes with the same storytelling style so the speech feels natural and compelling. Donald Trump's decision to impose tariffs wasn't born out of a random whim. It was a calculated move rooted in his belief that the U.S. had been treated unfairly in global trade for decades. He often spoke about bad deals and one-sided agreements, where America, in his view, was losing out while other countries gained at its expense. In his eyes, tariffs were a way to correct that imbalance, like adding weight to one side of a tilted scale so it could finally level out. During his presidency, Trump frequently used tariffs as a negotiating weapon. If another country had high barriers against American goods or was accused of practices like dumping cheap products into the U.S. market, he would announce tariffs to pressure them into coming to the table for a better deal. This approach wasn't limited to just one nation. It extended to big economies like China, the European Union, and even close allies like Canada and Mexico. To Trump, tariffs weren't just about economics. They were about pride and sovereignty. He framed them as a tool to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., revive industries that had been hollowed out by decades of outsourcing, and show the world that America would no longer be pushed around in trade. Whether you saw them as bold and necessary or risky and disruptive, his tariffs were always delivered with the message that America should stand tall and put its own interests first. The announcement of tariffs on China was one of the most dramatic moments in Trump's trade policy, sparking what many came to call a trade war. For years, he had argued that China was taking advantage of the U.S. through unfair trade practices, stealing intellectual property, manipulating its currency, and flooding American markets with cheap goods that undercut U.S. producers. In his view, the balance of trade between the two nations wasn't just lopsided, it was evidence of deep-rooted exploitation. When the tariffs were introduced, they targeted hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports. This meant everyday items, electronics, machinery, clothing, and even household goods were suddenly more expensive. For Trump, this wasn't a flaw in the plan, it was the point. He wanted companies to think twice before manufacturing in China and to start moving production back to the United States or other fairer trading partners. Of course, China didn't take it quietly. They retaliated with tariffs on American goods like soybeans, pork, and other agricultural products, hitting U.S. farmers directly. This tit-for-tat escalation raised tensions, but Trump saw it as necessary pain for long-term gain. In his mind, a short period of economic discomfort was worth it if it led to a future where America traded from a position of strength, not dependency. The tariffs on steel and aluminum were another bold stroke in Trump's economic agenda. He framed them not just as a trade measure, but as a matter of national security. His argument was that a country that can't produce its own steel and aluminum is vulnerable, dependent on foreign suppliers for the raw materials needed to build infrastructure, manufacture vehicles, and maintain military readiness. The move was particularly aimed at countries that Trump believed had been dumping excess steel and aluminum into U.S. markets at artificially low prices, driving American producers out of business. By imposing tariffs, he intended to give domestic industries the breathing room they needed to recover, rehire workers, and restart production. However, the policy was met with mixed reactions. Supporters in the Rust Belt saw it as a lifeline for industries that had been struggling for decades, while critics warned it could raise costs for manufacturers and hurt industries that rely on imported materials. Automakers, for example, feared the higher prices would make US-made cars less competitive abroad. Still, Trump stood firm. To him, protecting these core industries was about more than economics. It was about sovereignty and strength. If the U.S. couldn't produce the metals that formed the backbone of its economy, then in his view, it wasn't truly independent. The tariffs targeting China were perhaps the most defining and controversial aspect of Trump's trade war. He accused China of long-standing practices that, in his view, harmed American businesses: intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, currency manipulation, and the flooding of U.S. markets with cheap goods. These issues had been discussed by previous administrations, but Trump was determined to address them head-on, using tariffs as his main weapon. The strategy was aggressive. Billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, from electronics to household items, were hit with new duties. The idea was simple: make Chinese products more expensive in the U.S., so that American consumers and companies would turn to domestically made or non-Chinese alternatives. This, Trump argued, would pressure Beijing to change its trade practices. The move triggered a fierce response from China. They imposed their own tariffs on American exports like soybeans, pork, and other agricultural products, targeting industries vital to Trump's political base. This created a back-and-forth cycle of tariff escalations, often referred to as a tit-for-tat trade battle. While critics warned of higher prices for consumers and disruptions in global supply chains, Trump viewed the conflict as a necessary fight, one that might cause short-term discomfort but would lead to long-term fairness and economic stability. To him, the tariffs weren't just about numbers. They were about asserting that the United States would no longer tolerate trade practices he believed were unfair and exploitative. The tariffs on steel and aluminum marked another bold move in Trump's trade policy, aimed at protecting what he considered two of America's most vital industries. He argued that these metals were not only important for the economy, but also essential for national security, since they were used in building military equipment, infrastructure, and key manufacturing components. By imposing tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum imports, Trump sought to revive struggling American mills and smelters that had faced decades of decline due to cheaper foreign competition, particularly from countries like China, Canada, and members of the European Union. His administration framed the move as a way to save American jobs, restore industrial capacity, and reduce dependency on foreign suppliers. However, the policy drew swift criticism from allies and trade partners, many of whom felt unfairly targeted. Countries retaliated with their own tariffs on iconic U.S. goods, from bourbon to motorcycles, turning what was meant to be a focused measure into a broader trade spat. Economists also warned that higher metal costs could ripple through industries such as construction, automotive manufacturing, and consumer goods, potentially offsetting the benefits for domestic metal producers. Despite the controversy, Trump held firm, presenting the tariffs as a symbol of his America First agenda. To him, they were not just an economic tool, but a statement of independence, a way of saying that the U.S. would not sacrifice its manufacturing backbone for the sake of cheap imports. The agricultural sector became an unexpected battleground in the tariff war. When countries like China retaliated against U.S. tariffs, they often targeted American farm products, soybeans, pork, dairy, and corn, knowing these goods came from regions that heavily supported Trump politically. This retaliation was strategic, designed to pressure Washington by hitting rural communities in the heart of America. Farmers suddenly found themselves caught in the middle of a global economic standoff they hadn't started. Export markets that had taken decades to build began closing overnight, and prices for key crops fell sharply. Shipments that once went to China were now piling up in silos, unsold and losing value with each passing week. In response, the Trump administration rolled out multi-billion-dollar aid packages to help farmers weather the storm, framing it as necessary patriotism under pressure. Trump often praised farmers for their toughness, portraying them as soldiers in the fight for fair trade, even as many quietly worried about long-term damage to their markets. While some farmers stood by Trump, trusting his promise that short-term pain would lead to long-term gain, others feared that lost trade relationships might never fully recover. The tariff war had made agriculture not just an economic story, but a deeply political one, linking the fate of America's heartland to the broader chessboard of global trade. Manufacturing, once a symbol of American industrial pride, also felt the sting of tariffs in complex ways. On one hand, tariffs on imported steel and aluminum were meant to protect domestic producers, and indeed, some steel mills saw a revival, reopening plants and hiring workers. Trump hailed these moments as proof that his America First trade policy was working. But the story was not entirely one of victory. Many manufacturers relied on imported raw materials and components to produce their goods, and tariffs drove up the cost of those essentials. For small and mid-sized businesses, this meant shrinking profit margins, higher prices for customers, and in some cases, layoffs or plant closures. A factory making appliances, for example, might have celebrated cheaper domestic steel, only to find that other imported parts now cost far more, erasing any gains. This ripple effect spread through industries like automotive, construction equipment, and electronics, where supply chains were tightly interlinked across borders. Tariffs disrupted long-established production networks, forcing companies to choose between absorbing higher costs, passing them on to consumers, or moving production elsewhere to avoid the trade barriers. For Trump, the manufacturing narrative was a balancing act, celebrating the protection of certain industries while downplaying the strain placed on others. The reality was that tariffs, like a double-edged sword, could protect some jobs while endangering others, leaving communities to navigate the unpredictable consequences of global trade shifts. Farmers, often seen as the backbone of rural America, became some of the most visible casualties of the tariff battles. When tariffs were placed on Chinese goods, China quickly retaliated by targeting American agricultural exports, especially soybeans, corn, and pork. For decades, China had been one of the largest markets for U.S. soybeans, but suddenly shipments ground to a halt, prices plummeted, and storage silos overflowed with unsold crops. In towns across the Midwest, farmers faced an economic squeeze they hadn't anticipated. The cost of equipment and imported farm supplies climbed due to tariffs on metals and machinery, while their income from exports shrank. Many were forced to rely on government aid packages designed to offset the losses, payments that some saw as a lifeline, and others as a reminder that the trade war had become an expensive gamble. The emotional toll was as heavy as the financial one. Generational family farms handed down through decades were now under threat, with some owners selling land just to stay afloat. At coffee shops and community gatherings, the debate raged. Was this short-term pain worth the long-term goal of standing up to China? For some, loyalty to the vision of protecting American trade sovereignty outweighed immediate hardship. For others, the costs were simply too high to bear. Would you like me to now write the ending note for this Trump tariff story so it ties everything together powerfully? In the end, the story of the Trump tariff is not just about economics, but about choices and consequences. It is a reminder that every bold move on the world stage carries ripple effects that reach into the lives of ordinary people, farmers, factory workers, business owners, and consumers alike. For some, the tariffs symbolized strength and the willingness to protect American interests at any cost. For others, they were a gamble that exacted too high a price. History will continue to debate whether the pain was worth the potential gain, but one truth remains clear.